Hello, welcome to Making Creativity Pay. My name's Dan Barnett, and this podcast is about talking to those in creative industries about the business and promotional sides of their work. In this episode, I'll be talking to three performers who had shows at the 2022 Edinburgh Festival, and we'll be discussing whether the Edinburgh Fringe is a money pit, the physical, emotional and financial impact of performing for a whole month, how Edinburgh compares to other festivals, and a lot more. To begin with, I asked each of my guests to give a quick intro about their show, starting with Joz.
Hello, my name is Joz. I was at the Edinburgh Fringe this year with a show called Blink. It was a sort of an anti-magic show in which I played an ex-alternative comedian who had quit alternative comedy in order to rebrand themselves as the world's greatest magician and pull off the greatest magic trick ever attempted, which obviously goes wrong, and then various chaos things happen.
Stu?
Hello. So I did a show at Edinburgh just gone, which was a work in progress, which is all I seem to do nowadays. This year I did a show which had a title that doesn't matter because it's no longer the title, but it was a week's worth of me trying to talk about climate change and climate dread in a way that would be neither preachy nor well researched. And it was a success on my terms.
Cerys?
I was doing my debut Edinburgh show, which was called Sportsperson, which was meant to be like a fun, light-hearted show about gender and autism and playing sport. And then about a month before we took it up to the Fringe, the RFU England officially banned trans women from playing rugby. And so then this lovely heartwarming show that was about how, you know, the world is a terrible place, but you can find yourself in unexpected places like sports teams was then had to become about how sport is shit and we all feel terrible all the time. And it was directed by Joz and it had a puppet in it and it was very fun, despite all of the terrible context that existed outside of the room that I was performing the show in.
In terms of kind of promoting a show, we've just had that brief intro there. How do you get that into a poster, get that message across to someone to say, come see it, this is what you'll get?
I've got quite an unusual answer to that question because I discovered that this being my first foray into trying to talk about something that is, I suppose you could call it issues driven, as opposed to the issue being me and my life and my mental health. And I've always historically struggled with how much can I tell them in advance, but specifically this time I have the unusual problem of recognising that if I am too overt in saying this is a show about climate dread, that will put people off. And if I'm intending to talk about climate change for the foreseeable, as I may be, because it will at least remain topical, then is there a risk of becoming associated with a particular topic?
Cerys, so your show is very personal. I could do Stu's show. I do it terribly, but I could do his show. You know, your show I couldn't do because it's so much more about you. And how difficult is that to have as a performance, you know, and how much does that take out of you, that it's such a personal thing?
Well, I think it's one of those things, isn't it, where it is always a problem if you are a something performer to decide whether or not you're going to be that something performer. Because the shows that I most enjoyed at Edinburgh Fringe were the ones where my audience was like mostly other queer, neurodiverse people, and we had a nice time and there wasn't as much pressure to have to explain anything. But there's not very many of us and we don't have any money, and so it's not a commercially viable thing to do. But when you're doing, you know, a mixed bill, which is to a more mainstream audience, you've got to decide, am I going to have like an awkward minute at the top of my set where I give people all of my identity adjectives so that the rest of the material makes sense? Or am I going to do a bunch of stuff which has got nothing to do with any of those things, which still would be funnier if you did know those things about me, and then come off stage and then have people come up to you and be like, oh, I liked, you know, these jokes that you did, but you were really preachy when you were telling us that, like when you were literally just describing yourself. And so it's always a question that you have to ask when you're writing your set. And I mean, the show that we put together for Sportsperson, it was like a debut hour. Those are kind of meant to be about you. So I was never going to do a show without talking about those two things. But given that they are my life, like it's going to be, I think it would be harder for me to do an hour show without talking about those two experiences. And one of the conclusions that I came to by the end of Edinburgh was like, I'm very happy not being commercially viable if it means that I get to do material which is connecting to the people that I know that are going to get like the most out of it.
And Joz, I think you said that someone complained that it wasn't a proper magic act.
Yeah, we did have a bit of this. This was going back to the poster question. The whole show was modelled on that kind of David Copperfield aesthetic, like the very kind of sleek black and red, like showbiz Las Vegas kind of thing, because we basically wanted to use that as the centre of the show and then rip it apart as a metaphor for ego, basically. Like the whole show was about kind of paranoia and trying to control everything during lockdown and realising that you can't control, bits of your life are outside of your control. But I think because I have often struggled with the same kind of thing we're talking about like that feeling that you need to put yourself into a show and then trying to work out like how much of it needs to be about me and how much do I want it to be about the audience. So trying to kind of anchor it on, we're going to use the ego of this magician character as a stand-in for all of that. So we made all the marketing materials look like that, like look like we were marketing a kind of David Copperfield type magic show, but with enough clues in there that it was a sort of a stupid version of that. As it turns out, we didn't necessarily do the best job of making it clear that it was a kind of absurdist nonsense comedy parody of those things, because it was about halfway through, one of the magicians from Morgan and West, who are a really great fringe magic double act, came to see it and recommended it and said all magicians have to go and see this show, but didn't clarify that the reason they should see it was because it affectionately mocks and kind of subverts their, what they do. And we ended up just getting a lot of magicians in every single day who I think thought that I was like the new interesting magic act on the Fringe. And we did get the audience reviews, if you go on the Fringe site, are mostly really lovely. And then there's a couple that go, he didn't even do any proper magic tricks. Really disappointing, total waste of money. So I think this was a good lesson of the marketing thing, that like when you try and hinge the marketing of a thing on recognizable tropes from another genre and you make it look like a magic show or whatever else that you're kind of lampooning, you've got to be careful enough that it's clear that it's a parody, which I think mostly it was. Like the vast majority of audiences did understand what was going on, but I feel like maybe we needed to be that little bit more obvious about, like, by the way, we're taking the piss out of this genre, rather than sincerely trying to do it. And taking a piss out of it with like a lot of affection and research. Like I did magic for years and read about it a lot and really love it as a form. So it wasn't a cruel parody. It's just a genre I think is mad and ripe for playing with, really.
Is there a risk, Joz, that you lean too hard into pointing out it's a parody and
That's the thing,
stops being cool or interesting? It stops, you've answered the question in advance. So
I think that's what we had in mind when we were making it. Like, I don't think of it as like a parody magic show in the same way as, say, like I think Mischief Theatre were doing something similar this year of like the Mind Mangler, and it was very much like it's a piss take of Derren Brown or whatever, and that's very clear about its targets. It is parodying that thing. Whereas I felt like the show I made it's more a kind of weird conceptual theatre show that uses a lot of the imagery of magic as its way in. So I thought if I made it too obvious, this is a wacky magic parody, you sort of lose some of that journey of discovery for the audience. So that's why we made it subtler than we could have, is we didn't want people to turn up just thinking it was a lampoon show. But maybe we could have split the difference that little bit more.
And Cerys, you mentioned, you don't think necessarily the kind of audience for your show is necessarily commercially viable. I mean, how did you find kind of getting an audience and building it? Was that mainly through online and Twitter and things like that?
No, it was very difficult building an audience, I think, at Edinburgh this year. I know that there were a lot of people who came who have really big online presences, and they managed to translate that into shows. I've never been very good at the online stuff, so we did a lot of flyering. It's unclear. I'm still unclear as to how effective flyering is. Like, I know that I was quite selective, and some of our flyers were quite selective in terms of who we were flyering, sort of seeing the flyers as kind of like invites to the show, trying to find the right audience that way. I mean, our sales were not strong throughout the entirety of the Fringe. I know that I have met people and I've started to build an audience, but I did the show to two people on one night, which was very annoying because I'd sold more tickets than that, but then it rained a lot and then only 2 people came, and that was a very long hour. But yeah, tickets, we didn't have a very big audience for the show. It was one of those sort of, there were people who came to the show and they really enjoyed it and they said really nice things about the show, but there were not very many people who we got through the doors in the first place.
And did you kind of, I noticed on Twitter some people saying, they're kind of constantly refreshing their ticket sales. Were you like that? I mean, does the whole day build up where you're constantly saying, it's 10, it's 20, it's 5. So, refresh. Or there's another one. Good. Does your mood go up and down based on, if an extra couple of orders come in?
Yeah, I think definitely the beginning of the Fringe, that was the case. And then it's not a great way to spend the Fringe. So I think I hit a point in the month where then, like, I think once you've performed the show to 2 people and it goes all right, you can perform the show to any number of people. And so then if the ticket sales are only on like 7, then that's more than 2, you're going to have a lovely time. And I think I got used to that number of ticket sales, and then it doesn't really matter so much.
Because I know your showcase was about 4:30. I think was yours about 9?
8:20. Yeah.
8:20. Sorry. So you've got the whole day to kind of prepare, worry.
Yeah, and I really kind of like fret over it because I self-produce everything because I've never really understood. Well, no, I understand the role of a producer in Fringe shows, but it's the one of all those things like PR and marketing and all that. I think the production side is the one thing I've always felt like I don't want any help with because I know what I'm like and I know that I need to know all that stuff anyway. Because I think the role of a producer is they just take all that stuff out of your head. So all you need to do is turn up and do your show, and all the marketing and that kind of thing has been done. So you can concentrate on that. But I know that I obsess over, like, I want to know if this has been done and how many people are in and whether the flyers are doing, like, so if I had a producer, I would just meddle, I would just annoy them, and I would get anxious thinking like, oh, I hope they've done this. Not because of a lack of trust or anything, but I think I know that's my personality type, is I get obsessive. So I was one of those people that was kind of, I would check the ticket sales all the time and constantly tell myself, like, there's only so much you can do, so try to just have a nice time during the day. But I did struggle with it, and I forgot in the years that I didn't do the Fringe because of COVID, I forgot how much I stress about it. So it was kind of weird to go back into that and to go, oh yeah, this consumes your entire day, actually. I really tell myself, like, try and create a nice life for yourself outside of the show, but I find it really difficult to do that because I get too into it, I think.
Yeah. And Stu, you were only up for a week and it was lunchtime. So it was almost like a holiday for you, was it?
In some respects, yes. I think it's interesting hearing what you say, Joz, about the timing thing. I am thrilled to do a lunchtime show. I did it 1:20 p.m. Nice. And even though it's much harder to get people in, and I struggled, and the show was not financially viable this year, doing a week, there's not enough time to build any word of mouth about it. I was kind of doing it stealth, which sounds cool until you're there and you're like, oh, I don't have any advertising. But there are huge benefits for my mental health. And it's exactly as you say, I would be keyed up all day, particularly because it was a work in progress show that I was adding to and writing on every day. The fact that I could get it done by 2:30, and then when I'm at Edinburgh, I've got other things going on. I'm also kind of seeing, the week I think I saw 34 shows, which I'm scouting for my podcast. So scouting is a ludicrous way of saying I go and see some shows. But like I've got other things, I've got like a list of things that are other requirements. So it did feel in some ways like a holiday because I was just there. And this is one of the bigger issues for me with Edinburgh at the moment when I'm deciding what to do in 2023 is to do with whether Edinburgh, as Cerys mentioned earlier on, the notion that Edinburgh is where you build an audience is something that I've been working on for years. This will probably be my 30th Edinburgh Festival next year, were I to go. The 29th or 30th, something like that. Not always with hours of stand-up, but I've done 10 or 11 hours of stand-up. And I had always been working on the presumption that is where you build an audience. And I think that's shifted now. I think Edinburgh 2022 showed me it was like the dynamite year for people who had large online followings, selling out their small room shows months in advance and having a wonderful time while everyone else not crashed and burned, but everyone else had to work
stressed.
A lot harder.
Yeah,
stressed. It was a very stressful time for a lot of people. So I wonder whether, for the first time in my life, I'm wondering whether it's worth going next year. Because if I can't make a profit because the accommodation is so expensive that I can't make a profit, and I've done years where it cost me $7,000. I feel like I've put in the hard yards of having like 4 years where it not only wasn't profitable, but it cost me thousands. I had got it up to a stage where I had enough of a following to make a profit. I could sell enough tickets to do that. And now I'm thinking if the accommodation prices remain at their current an inflated version of the previously inflated prices, is it possible? Because what's the advantage in going to Edinburgh if you are building an audience through social media or building an audience online? If those are the success stories now, rather than... I tell you what it is, it's not that those are the success stories, it's that we can look at the data a bit more clearly now and say, for every Jordan Gray who did a fantastic show and had the dream Edinburgh that everyone aspires to, whereby it telegraphs, it explodes into a whole other phenomenon, there are 30 people who built an audience online and then went to Edinburgh as a means of reaping the benefit in ticket sales of having those online, the financial benefit, I mean, of having that online audience. So it's always been a question for me as to whether, you know, where the cart is before the horse, or the cart is happening simultaneously to the horse and consequently not moving. I'm really interested in that question, and I've never felt less certain about it.
It's sort of like a risk-reward thing as well, it feels to me, of like the rewards of doing Edinburgh are the same as they've always been, or perhaps even smaller, because there's the same number of kind of jobs or opportunities available, but more and more people doing them. But the risks are so much higher. So from the maths of it, you do look at like the more you keep going, the more you're kind of gambling the cost of it, and the opportunity of what you might get back is smaller and smaller.
I have an answer to that point, but Cerys also was saying.
Oh yeah, yes.
I was just going to say, I think it's going to be very difficult. So I had like a similar feeling to you in terms of that kind of shift, but I think 2023 is going to be a really important year, because there was always going to be a point where Indians who have amassed massive followings on like TikTok and other kind of social media platforms came to Edinburgh, and then we all find out whether or not that translates into like good live shows. But also because of the pandemic and because of 2021 Fringe being sort of like a different kind of festival altogether, it meant that this year there were a lot of comedians who were debuting their first ever shows who already have done like Live at the Apollo, and already have done have like not a big following because of their social media presence, but because they've done a lot of TV. And so it's going to be really interesting to see next year, once all of those shows are out of the way, is 2023 going to be more similar to 2019 Edinburgh, or is it going to be more similar to 2022 Edinburgh? I think it's going to be more like this year just gone. And I think Edinburgh is only going to be commercially viable for people who, like, not even within the month itself, but only for people who are going to sell out their run, and then this is the launch pad for their tour, which is then going to make them like a lot of money. It's now going to be that Edinburgh is, for a lot more people, Edinburgh is your sunk cost, and if you don't have the infrastructure and you're not doing this like full-time professionally, and so you make more money after the Fringe because of the Fringe, that it's going to be like just not commercially viable, but as Joss says, the losses are now something that you can't absorb by working all year round and like saving for it and putting aside money so that you can go and have a nice time, because it's no longer a nice time.
As to that point you make about debuts, that's what I was going to say in response to Joss as well. I think what Edinburgh showed us in 2022 is that there were 2 years with no proper Edinburgh Festival, not a real version of it, and yet TV still had an intake of new people that were becoming the new people, and it made us realise, I think it made me realise how disconnected the Edinburgh Festival is from the machinations of the TV industry, and specifically the intake of new talent. Exactly as you say, Cerys, there were people debuting who already had big TV profiles, and so it kind of showed us the truth that the pipeline hasn't ever really worked like that. It was just they were happening at the same time, or or maybe it's a case that there are so many comics now who have a big following on social media, TikTok and Reels and what have you, that some of them are absolutely brilliant in a room as well.
I mean, if you kind of said to someone who didn't know anything about Edinburgh, you say, right, arts in general, very London-centric, let's move everyone up to the other end of the country where they have to stay for a month and pay ridiculous fees to compete with thousands of other people. It sounds
it's like
insane.
London, only somehow more elite. Yeah.
It's how do, I mean, Cerys, I know you've done, is it Aberystwyth, Machynlleth, and I don't know, Leicester and some of the others. I mean, how do they feel and how do they perform compared to Edinburgh?
Well, I think they're all different. So my first festivals that I did Brighton, because that's, quite close to London, and Green Man. So those were my first experiences of like putting shows together and then taking them to festivals, and those are obviously quite different. And I think there's like a huge variety. So you've got things like the Fringe, where anybody can apply and go, and then you've got things like Machynlleth, where it's more of a curated festival. And I'm definitely learning that I really like the festivals where I'm invited to go there, and they pick the number of shows and they put them at the time, which means that they know how many people are going to be probably at the festival, and pretty much everybody sells out and you don't really have to do anything, as opposed to going to a new city that you've never performed in before and then having to learn all of the intricacies. Like Brighton Fringe, you're probably better off just doing like 1 or 2 shows rather than trying to do like a full run. If you try and flyer in anywhere that isn't Edinburgh Fringe, people will look at you like you are having a nervous breakdown on the street. I've had flyers like in Brighton, I've had flyers like spat at before trying to give out flyers for my show, because the people there just did not want their days interrupted for a festival that they weren't even aware was happening. And so I think there are lots and lots and lots of different festivals, and what I am learning is that instead of trying to do as many as possible, it's definitely better to have your one that you know really well. Like if you understand where is the good place in Leicester to perform, what's the best weekend where the festival is like really hitting its peak, if you know the like community groups within the city that you can go and tell them about your show and arrange for like group tickets and things like that, then you'll have like a much nicer time. But no one has the time to do that for every single festival in the UK calendar. So I think it's good to be like quite kind of smart with your resources and really invest in a like specific festival that you're going to make your one and build your audience. Because otherwise what you do is you spend your year travelling around the country performing to 6 or 7 people in cities that you've only ever visited because you've arrived on a train, done your show, felt really sad about it, got a McDonald's to cry into on the train home, and that's like the entirety of your festival cycle, which is rubbish.
Jos, I mean, how have you found different festivals? I mean, I know you've did Blink. Was it the Soho Theatre?
I did Blink at Soho, yeah. It went round a bunch of festivals this year, so I did Leicester, Machynlleth, Aberystwyth. We did a show in Brighton, but not as part of the festival. So it's been round a bunch of these places. But I think I'd say I agree broadly with the thing of like, you end up having your experience of all these festivals, basically. Like, things like Machynlleth, I think, they're so well curated and so well run and so kind of bedded in with the comedy community that I did it for the first time this year, so I don't know this for sure, but from everything I hear, it sounds like it's hard to go there and have a bad time. But there are festivals that I love performing at where I know I have an audience, like Leicester, where I know other people have said that they find it tricky and they don't know how well it's organised and that kind of thing. And then other times I've done Brighton Fringe and struggled to find an audience, and I know other people who love Brighton Fringe and have huge audiences there. So I think, like Cerys is saying, like, it's all about the level of engagement that you can give to that festival. Like, when I first started playing Leicester was in 2013, I think, and I played to about 15 people and felt a bit demoralised and a bit like, oh, I don't know if that was worth all the train fare and the accommodation and all that kind of thing. But I kept going back every year, and now I know I have that audience there. So I think those kind of like touring things and playing festivals like that, it really is it's a thing of across multiple years of building those audiences. Unless you happen to be one of the people that is being booked for something like Machynlleth, where we're saying like there's a kind of a pre-built audience there. But generally, I think it does come down to how much time you can put in over multiple years to make that festival work for you, rather than like, oh yeah, this one's always good, you'll be fine. This one's always bad, it's not worth doing. I think it's a thing you build up over time, I think, festival appearances.
And Steve, I mean, do you kind of find, and I know it's the kind of thing that, we were saying, is Edinburgh still the be-all and end-all, where it almost seems as if, from February time, people are doing previews for shows in August in Edinburgh. It seems like the whole of their year, August finishes, so maybe October, November, they'll write a show, do a little bit on it. Then from February, they're doing previews. So the majority of the year is previewing for the big thing, which is Edinburgh. And, should Edinburgh still be that big thing?
Well, I think it's down to the investment. There's no such thing as a festival. I'm very fond of pointing out things that don't exist. There's no such thing as the comedy industry. There's no such thing as a festival. It's just an individual or individuals who at one point got together and said, shall we program a bunch of shows at the same time? And then those things have lasted or not lasted. So they only have as much sort of weight as we, the comics, and the audiences, invest in them. So I think part of why Edinburgh is such a big deal is that it's heroic. It feels like such a heroic challenge to turn over an hour every year or every other year, or just to write a new hour, whatever point it is in your creative life, it feels so heroic to go up there. I mean, Americans can't believe it when they come over here and they're like, I have to do the same hour show in the same room every night for near as damn it 30 nights. It's ludicrous. And so because it's such a challenge, we go, oh yeah, and we deal with, we treat it like the trenches, and we treat it like we're going over the top. And, I think those things are what give it this kind of mythic weight in the life of many a British comedian. So it as an entity in itself, it only has the value that we put in it. So if we all decided, if enough of us went, do you know what, Leicester's where it's at, and actually February's such a great time in the year. Like, I mean, I personally, in my calendar of festivals, if a show is finished in September and ready to tour, because I've gradually over the last few years started using Edinburgh as a warm-up for a tour, then and everyone is on that scale. I mean, there are Australian acts or even British acts who frequent Australia who will regard Edinburgh as the victory lap you do with the show that you did in Melbourne in whenever Melbourne is, March or April. But for me, I'll go, okay, I try to break the routine of having to start writing the new show on day one in September and try and push it back. So now I start in day one in February. So Leicester really works for me because I go, oh, that's going to be very work in progress. That's going to be my first attempt at putting all the notes in the right order. And then by the time Machynlleth Festival comes around, it's normally like, oh, that's a shape. There we go. Let's see if this shape works. And I think these things are deliberately programmed. If I was to create a festival, I'd go, oh, well, what's a good time in the year? What will suit people? Do I want it to be a sharpening things up festival where we can charge a bit more on tickets? Or do I want it to be an absolute loose all over the place festival? So that has a big impact on, I think, when in the year it occurs has a big impact on the material. In terms of building an audience, I think that I was in a rhythm of doing that for a few years, of going back and back and back to a place. I certainly would thrive more at festivals that have a pay what you want element to them. I think there are enough comedy fans at a really comedy specific festival like Mac or ABBA that I feel like there are enough people there who'll know me that I can be confident of selling a small room. But having not personally made the jump even in my touring, there's only very few towns in which I've jumped from a 100 to a 200 seater. So, and that's primarily, I think, because I don't have that social media. My podcast listenership, they're nerdy about comedy and they're interested in how I think, but it's not like a show where I'm funny every week. So it's not a sort of mouth of the funnel for an intake of people to come and see me do stand-up in the way that we have seen some pretty incredible funnels with pretty enormous hungry mouths develop over the last few years.
You just mentioned about pay what you want. And I think, Cerys, you said, I think we did a Q&A before the festival where you were kind of saying that the venue to some extent sets the floor for pricing. So you don't have that flexibility that maybe you'd say, well, I'd rather have 30 people paying a fiver than 10 paying £10, But if the venue says, no, £10 the floor, I mean, how difficult is that, and how did that feel constrained?
I think it's difficult. So I've done the Fringe before on the Free Fringe as like part of improv shows and split bills and stuff. And this was my first time doing one of the paid venues and in quite like a big established venue. I was in Gilded Balloon this year. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the price of the tickets because, there's like a minimum that you're allowed to charge. And I think that minimum was too much for my target audience. And I would have liked people to, like anyone to be able to come. But one thing that I've been thinking about after chatting to some other performers who were on Free Fringe, who were on like the £5 or pay what you want Fringe this year, is that maybe a benefit of having tickets is that like the people who had come to see my show were invested in my show when they got in the door. Whereas if you're on like anyone can walk in, you do get a lot more of people who are just going to take a punt, and if they don't like it, they're going to leave, or if they don't like it, they're going to disrupt the show. And we did 4 out of every 7 performance was a relaxed performance, and had very clear rules for the relaxed performance, which was that people can enjoy the show in whatever way they want. So if you have got verbal tics, if you have to like get up and move around, I had people who came to see my show who were on their phones, and all of these things are things that I think is really important that people should be able to do when they're watching the show. And I don't think these things mean that they're not engaging with the show, but those people had like paid to get into the show beforehand, so it wasn't that they'd come into the show not really invested and then they were switching off by playing on their phone. It was that being on their phone is the thing that allowed them to focus on the show now that they were there. And we had like people were on relaxed performances, you can leave and come back in, which a couple of people did because obviously it was so hot in the room and things like that. And they were very respectful when they did that. And I don't think I'm ever going to do a paid venue again, mostly because I personally can't afford the rental fees and things. But I think it will be interesting to try and do the same relaxed performance in a free Fringe or pay what you want Fringe setting next year, because I am curious to see how much that purchasing of a ticket affects the way that you treat that relaxed performance. And the relaxed performance is very much designed for people to be able to express themselves in whatever way they want, and for me to roll with that and to say, I'm not going to accuse you of disrupting the performance, but I didn't have anyone who came to my show who deliberately tried to disrupt the performance, because why would you pay £10 for a ticket just to go and like ruin a show? I say that people did do that. I know that Jen Ives had like a number of nights where transphobic people bought tickets deliberately to go and disrupt her show. So for some people that's, you know, not enough money to deter them. But I think it's going to be interesting next year for me if I do have, because I've done, you know, free Fringe before at like 9 o'clock on a Friday night when you get like a large, much more drunk crowd in, and trying to have like the goodwill for people when I find it harder to tell the difference between whether or not someone is disrupting this to be disruptive or is just expressing themselves and potentially their like neurodiversity or whatever. That I think is going to be very much harder to do the show in a relaxed performance setting, and also like to be able to protect the audience that is coming to my show and to tell them they're going to have a nice time. Like I need to be able to sort of be in charge so that everybody is able to have a nice time, relaxed performance or not. So that's the thing that I am thinking about next year, knowing that I'm going to be doing pay what you want if I can. We need to probably need to think slightly more about how we run the relaxed performance, because I think having paid tickets is maybe one way that makes that more viable.
I felt like this year was really the year where Monkey Barrel kind of finally established itself as like, oh, we now have the monopoly on comedy at the Fringe, and Monkey Barrel is the venue that sort of probably the best known venue that runs the pay what you want model at the moment. I know there are others and I forget exactly how many there are or which ones they are, but I think over the last few years Monkey Barrel has kind of been gradually reshaping the comedy landscape up there, because it's a year-round venue. It's there all the time, so it runs shows throughout the year, so it has a local audience that know about it and really care about it, but also it programs a bunch of shows that people, they know that it's going to be good quality programming there. And I think previously that was pleasant. So I think it was always pleasant that people were like, we know that we can get a good show if we go there. And it felt like this was the first year where you could see people changing their spending habits a bit, I think. Because I think the final reports were something like ticket sales were down 25% overall in the big four venues or something like that. Some shows sold out and did incredibly well. Others did less well, but like across the board it was that bit lower. But as far as I could tell from things I went to see and from people I spoke to at Monkey Barrel just always had the loyalty of that audience, because they keep their prices low and they have that policy of like 10% of tickets are just available for walk up on the day. And I think there are, I don't think it's like a blanket, like Monkey Barrel have got it right and all the others haven't. Like Monkey Barrel isn't an accessible venue, and there are reasons why places like the Pleasance have to charge more for tickets, because they have such a bigger outlay in terms of rent, because they have to rent their rooms from the university. And they have more staffing costs, all this kind of thing. So I don't think it's just that all the big four venues should copy Monkey Barrel's business model, but I felt like this was the year where we saw in audience behaviour, like, oh, audiences actually really value this. Like Monkey Barrel have created a reputation and a model that people appreciate, because people don't have much money. Like I think people are scared and are worried about it. So I wonder over the next couple of years whether the big four venues will need to, I don't know whether it's that they start to do pay what you want themselves, or they just start to change some of how what they do works, but it felt much more tangible this year of like, that's where the core comedy audience was, and it was always a case of trying to kind of win them over and go, come and take a chance on this slightly more expensive show, please. And I felt more conscious of that than I have done in previous years, I think.
Stu, do you think if you did go next year, it would still be pay what you want?
I really thrived on the free Fringe, because as a non-famous comedian, with good shows, I think, most years, good all years. The biggest hump I have to get is to get people in through the door who haven't heard of me. When it's free fringe, I can get them in through the door, I can give them a really, really high quality show, and I'm really good at making them feel good about donating. When allowing them to feel good, allowing them to self-actualize as donors. And I think that one of the struggles I have with Pay What You Want is that it kind of clips my wings. The fact that some people in the room have paid and some people are invited to donate, I really struggle with. I think it fundamentally changes the core message of asking for money at the end of a show. And as the margins change and become tighter and it becomes harder and harder to make any money from Edinburgh, I think that's a core issue. I've also got children. That's the other big different, that's the big shift in the Edinburghs I do now compared to the ones I did years ago, which are that I can't go away from them completely for a month. I have to rent somewhere to put them up in for at least 2 weeks in the middle. And again, that means I have to double the already inflated rent. So I'm just thinking now as I listen to these conversations going, what is the number? How much do I need to make every day in order to be able to break even? And I've always, I've operated on that basis before for many years. And then I found myself in a position of going, I'm really thriving here. These are some good years. This is the payoff for all of those years that cost me $7,000. And now I'm thinking that the break even point may not be achievable. So I am attracted to the free fringe. I love Monkey Barrel. I love what they've done. I just think that, I'd love to see some numbers. I'd love to see some numbers from people who sold out big runs there. And I'd love to, because I used to know what the numbers were. And I feel like I don't know what the numbers are anymore. So I need to do some research. I need to talk to some people and go, did you make a profit from venue A because you actually have a friend or someone did you a favour or a hotel took pity on you, as I know happened in one case? And so there are so many moving parts to it. It's really difficult.
I think the interesting thing about like Monkey Barrel this year is that there were a lot of people who did Pleasance in previous years and did benefit and build up quite a big audience from being at Pleasance in like 2019 and had really good debut shows and then went on to do like a lot of telly stuff in the interim and then have come back and done Monkey Barrel instead of Pleasance, which presumably was financially a better decision for them because the rental cost is like the upfront cost is so much lower, and then they were going to sell out. And I think that changes a lot of things for the audience, because why would you pay £10 upfront to go see someone that you've never heard of before doing their debut show? Or why would you even go and see a free fringe show that you're going to give money to probably at the end with someone that you've never heard of, when you could go see someone that you're a big fan of that you've seen on the TV multiple times for £5 or potentially no money if you like queue up early enough for that discount. So I think it's not just to do with the venues, it's also to do with who's making like which. If you were going to separate out comedians into kind of like tiers based on their online following or their like television presence and how kind of big they are, and then allocate like probably how much people would be prepared to go and see them, how much are those comedians shifting between those tiers, and what kind of impact does that have on people who have less choice when they're coming to Fringe, maybe for the first time or maybe for the 10th time, but they've got their niche which isn't appreciated in the same way by venues, and so they have limited choices in terms of where they can go.
I think just to add to that, I think it's almost like it's to liken it to social inequality is obviously trite, but let's just think of it for a minute as it's fame inequality. There are so many more famous people either for TV reasons or social media reasons than there ever were, and the challenge 20 years ago was, or 15 years ago, was what if big name act John Bishop or Jimmy Carr or whoever, if they come and if there was a sort of feeling that for them to do a show during the Edinburgh Festival would hoover up loads of tickets, and there was a, you know what I mean, that that otherwise, punters wouldn't spend their money on trying something out because a famous person they recognise was nearby. There's a counter argument to that, which is the fact of those famous people going there is great for the Fringe, and the tide rises all ships. Who knows? But I certainly feel like it has that issue is ongoing, and more so because now there are so many, exactly as you say, Cerys, there are so many people who are famous at Monkey Barrel. Who, I mean, I think that I want to see some numbers, because of those famous people with TV profiles who are on at the hipster venues where we would normally expect to see the likes of me, Joz, and Cerys, maybe, they're like the big TV profile people. How many of them are doing £5 tickets at Monkey Barrel because they can operate the whole thing as a sunk cost? Like, that was always a problem, but the problem used to be, the people doing Pleasance 1 and selling 600 tickets a night, they're separate to us. And now it's like, no, quite a lot of people, either through TV fame or social media fame or reach of some sort, quite a lot of people are able to go there and not make any money because they're prepping for a tour or what have you. And which isn't to say that, who's to say which thing is right? Festivals don't exist. Venues don't exist. There is no supposed. There's no right way of doing it. It's just capitalism, isn't it? It's just in a sharp relief, market forces happening to all of us. And I certainly enjoyed it 10 or 15 years ago when it felt like more of a level playing field. And I say that totally aware of my privilege in terms of the fact that I was full-time as a comic quite quickly and was able to make money doing, God knows, a corporate awards ceremony and think, great, I've banked my rent for Edinburgh. That's a position of privilege as well. But I certainly feel like it's got harder and less fair.
I think potentially a different way of thinking about it would be that, so if in the past you've got your very famous comedians coming to Edinburgh and they have like a ripple effect on everything, what we have now is that a lot more people achieve like a smaller amount of success and fame. So it's less that there are like more famous people and more that fame tier has kind of expanded out, and so you've got a lot of people who maybe have been on like some Dave panel shows, and so they're building like a TV kind of presence that way, but that's not the same as being on like a BBC One kind of primetime slot, coming out of doing your debut at Edinburgh and then walking into a sitcom deal. Or achieving the kind of fame of like John Bishop, for example. And so you've still got the very, very, very famous, they will sell out like the Apollo for their tour show, people at the top. But then that second tier where it is, commercially viable for them to be a professional comedian, they know that they can sell 100 to 200 seater theatres kind of around the country, has massively expanded. And those people probably see themselves as like, they still have to gig pretty much every single week in order to be able to afford their rent, especially if they live in London. They're don't see themselves as like having all of the wealth privilege of being super famous. They've built like a sort of like following, but they're not top tier. And there are a lot more of them who potentially, if they are gigging with the likes of like James Acaster, Ed Gamble, people like that, maybe they see themselves more as they're not famous because they hang out with much more famous people, and then there's a lot, and it's the same with like TikTok comedians and stuff. People were talking a lot about whether or not Edinburgh Fringe is the right place for them, but it's still like amazing that you can become a professional, well-known comedian without actually ever having to get onto the live comedy circuit, because there are lots of reasons why people can't do that, because it's really toxic, because it's not accessible, because they don't get booked because of who they are. We've had this like massive democratization of the comedy circuit where comedy producers and bookers are no longer in control of who gets to have a following. And so it's definitely different, and it's definitely making it harder, but that doesn't mean that maybe in the long run it won't end up being better, and there might be like more point of access for more people.
I think one of the difficulties with it is just what it changes psychologically, really, for what the Fringe is, because I think at one point the costs of it, not just for acts but also for audiences, but were low enough that the kind of prevailing mindset of going to the Fringe was like, I want to discover something, or I want to find one of those things that can only happen at the Fringe, or there was that spirit of like, anything can happen here and who knows what's going to happen. If you try this thing out, you might discover you're the best thing you've ever seen. And I think because of all the economical factors at play with it, people who go up there now must also have spent the same amount on rent that we spend as comics to go up there. Maybe more, because they might not be happy to stay in rubbish student accommodation. If it's like their big holiday of the year, then they might want to stay somewhere quite nice. So they might have spent big money on it, and they're buying tickets. So it does become a case of thinking like, I can't afford to take as many risks on things. Like, I want to be able to see stuff where I've seen it already and I know that I like it, which is probably why you see the online stuff doing so well, or people with profile doing so well at the Fringe, is because I think it's a bigger ask for an audience now to say, oh, just risk 15 quid of your own money on this thing that you don't know anything about because you've not seen me and you don't know much about this kind of comedy or whatever. So I think it just runs the risk of changing what that festival represents in a way, or what the mood of it is. It changes it from a like, anything can happen, let's discover things, to like, we can go and see our favourite comedians here for hopefully not too much money. And over a long period of time, it might be that sort of, well, I don't know what it'll do to it.
Sorry, Steve. I was going to say, from my position as a punter, yes, there's that kind of thing where if I'd have gone 10 years ago, there may be half a dozen people I'd know or have seen. Whereas now, there's probably 50 or 100 that, I've seen their sketches or whatever on TikTok, Twitter, whatever. And so when you've got two people in front of you, right, 6 o'clock, who do I see? The person I'm vaguely aware of and I think is funny, or the person I've got absolutely no idea. It could be the best show, it could be the worst show. Generally speaking, most people will play safe. Some will be a bit more adventurous, but generally you'll go with what you've got a bit of an idea on. And I think like you said, Joz, if you're going there as a punter, you're spending money, you're going to want probably to kind of almost in advance to say, right, Tuesday night I'm seeing this, this and this, Wednesday I'm seeing this and this, and you've almost got it mapped out before you go. There's no serendipity anymore.
Yeah. Which I think makes total sense. I think there's no other way of doing it logically, but I just think it then puts so much more pressure on the artists who are doing it, that they've got to not just make a show that they believe is the best thing that they're able to make at the moment and worthy of showing to people, but they've also got to be their own manager, essentially, and their own marketing person, and run an online campaign and a print campaign, all these things. I mean, like I say earlier, you can hire people to do that stuff for you, and it's something I refuse to do, so maybe that's not the case. But like, it feels like we're just being pushed more and more to have to be on top of everything in order to have any access to doing well at these things.
I think with Edinburgh, I remember, and this is only my interpretation of it at the time, but I feel like the dynamic with Edinburgh used to be, is this the Olympics of performing where everyone does come and gives it their absolute best shot, or is it an open access arts festival whereby anyone can have a go? And there was a sort of a tension there, and I think the answer, of course, is, well, it was both, and it always was both. And now I feel like, okay, is it thing A, is it thing B, or is it simply an opportunity to see your favourite people from social media? And it probably is that as well. That's in the mix now as well. And it's speaking as a dinosaur who started his comedy career before social media existed. I can't help, and I recognise how sort of petty this is, but I can't help but resent the job having shifted under my feet. Because it used to be, you go to Edinburgh, it's fun, it costs you money, but there is hope that one day it'll turn a profit. You hang out with your friends, you feel like for once that month in the year you don't feel like an outsider, you feel like an insider because the community is there, and you get to do your show and people come and see it and they laugh. And I always felt like, the resistance, it was like, you do that, resisting the idea. I felt like I'm internally, nobly resisting the idea that I have to bring a finished product here and indulge in the industry stuff in order to make it. And now I feel a sort of a similar tension with the idea that, is this just the showcase that we come to once we've got 100,000 followers across a couple of different platforms and we come and please them? Do you see what I mean? But having said that, I very much take Cerys' point about there being a multiplicity of access now. Or certainly we're taking sort of steps towards that. I do appreciate there are fewer gatekeepers. I just think that there is one big gatekeeper and it's called the algorithm. And is that how everyone wants to spend their creative time, trying to chase algorithmic success on numerous platforms which all promote things that cause arguments? Like all the clips I have online, I have very few clips online by the standards of a lot of people, but the ones I have with 1 million plus plays are all things in which an argument has started in the comments, and that's boosted it up. That's boosted it. So I'm not suggesting that people don't earn and deserve their success on social media, but there is another big gatekeeper in there, and that gatekeeper is constantly changed and shifted by teams of people in labs that we never meet in order to keep us all addicted. So that doesn't feel as positive. As you know, that's one of the downsides. Of course, there are numerous benefits in terms of access and what have you.
Well, yeah, I guess it's just that being good at social media isn't this. It's a different skill set to being funny on stage, and it's really nice when those two things overlap. And there'll be lots of people where we'll go see their show and we'll be like, "That's amazing." I completely understand why they've got 1 million Twitter followers, because they're really funny. And then there were definitely people that I went to see who I liked their stuff online, and then I went to see their show and I was like, why have I sat through an hour of this? This has been terrible and now I feel really old. And then that feels really unfair because they have sold out their Fringe run because they had a really big online presence, but their Fringe show wasn't what I was looking for, because those two things aren't equivalent skill sets. And if you just want to make the live show that you want to make, why should you be expected to be really good at something which is now like a real job that people get employed to do and that you train to do, and you have to have a lot of experience to be able to do well? They're just two different things, and I'm rubbish at it, so I don't want it to be the I don't want it to be the deciding factor of whether or not people are going to come see my show.
We'll notice that Dan's sample size here is people who were available enough to come on his podcast.
So, I mean, in terms of, like I said, Steve, you did a week. The other two you did a month. Is there some kind of happy medium? Can you, if you went to the players and said, right, I want the room for the month, but that's between me and 2 or 3 other performers. And so I do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, someone else does Thursday, someone else does Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Are they open to those kind of things where, you kind of say, right, I want the room, I'm responsible for the room, but then what goes on in that room can differ across the 30 days?
Never tried it.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think there was a lot of talk about short runs this year because a lot of shows on the awards list at the end of the month did shorter runs. So everyone went, oh, wow, we can do shorter runs, it kind of annoyed me because you could always do shorter runs. Like, the rules didn't change or anything. It was just that this year some people happened to do that and get nominated for an award, and it felt like that was the reason for talking about it, which I thought was a bit of a shame. But it's always been possible to book a venue for less time. I think the problem is if everybody suddenly decides that's what they want to do, it puts the venues in a very difficult position because they go, well, the festival is a month long and we need to fill the rooms for a month, and we've got this person who wants to do a week at the start and this person who wants to do a week at the end, and also so many people will want it to be at the end. If their reason is because they think they can still win the award by doing a 2-week run, then everybody's going to want to do those last 2 weeks, which then means they've got to work out who does things for the first week. I think the idea of doing short runs is great because I think the festival's too long and it's exhausting, and I think it's really taxing on people's mental health. Personally, my reason for doing the month was because I'd spent a lot of money on hiring other people to work on my show, and I wanted to do as many performances as possible to make as much money back as possible and to be able to pay them the fees they deserve. So that's why I did the month, was because you make more money. But I think the month is madly too long, and I think the better way to try and... I think basically the whole festival ought to be shorter. I think what we learned is short runs seem to be better for people's well-being, but you sort of have to do a long run because that's the only way to make the margins make sense. So the only way to do it would be for all of the margins to change, I think. But then, Stu, you did a week, so obviously maybe you'll have a different...
Yeah, I think in Adelaide, at the Adelaide Festival, the Fringe Festival, they do 2-week runs, and there's like a change. There's a halfway point where everyone's like, "Oh, great!" Some people do the whole month because they've brought the Edinburgh system, but there is a nice kind of the room, like reinforcements. There's a whole different vibe, and I think I'm guessing, but I'm sure that their awards procedures reflect that. I wonder, and I certainly know from looking on, pro comic Facebook groups, I saw a thread recently where someone said, right, I'm booking for a thing in August, who's not going up this year? A lot of people were commenting, I'm only going up for the last 2 weeks. I'm only going up for 2 weeks. I'm only doing 2 weeks this year. Like a lot of credible people who you'd expect to be doing the month. So that's definitely considering changing. What will happen, of course, is that the market will decide. And if enough people go to the big venues and say, I only want to do the last 2 weeks, then they will offer more favourable deals for people who only want to do the first 2 weeks. Yeah. And so it will further stratify in a way that probably isn't good. But also, if the festival's only 2 weeks long, I will find that more attractive as a parent and less attractive as someone who wants to go and do something heroic. Do you know what I mean? Like, part of the attraction is this long, fucking difficult thing, and I'm proud of that, and I'm proud of my ability to thrive within it. And if it becomes... I think, personally, everyone should start doing 45-minute shows max, and there's a 15-minute changeover. That's how we can rotate them through. No show needs to be an hour long, but that's a different podcast.
I did this year. I did the full run, but I did 2 preview shows at the beginning, and also I did the last day, which was technically one day after the last day, and I had one day off in the middle. And I think when I did maybe the 20th show, because I did like the full run, as many days as you possibly could do with one break in the middle. And I think when I got to about day 20, I was like, I now know the show is not developing from day to day. I now do not feel anymore the benefit of doing it every single day, because whilst on the one hand many people go up to the Fringe because you can say that you've done the Fringe and you've done the whole run and it's very heroic, on the other hand, like, just doing the show every single day does make it better. And I think there is an optimum point where you reach that point and you're like, having done the show X many days in a row, I have really perfected it in a way that I couldn't do if I'd only done like one every month for a year. And then when you get past that point, then you can start to overthink things or get fed up with the show or get bored with the show. And so I think everyone has an optimum, and it would be good if we could all work out what optimum is and go up for the optimum. I spoke to my agent this year about whether or not next year I could do, because I would like to do the Fringe again, but just at a significantly lower price. And so I spoke to him about doing maybe 2 weeks or doing less time, and he was concerned for someone at my level being able to be able to do that, to negotiate that with a venue and be able to say, I only want to do this many weeks or these days. He thinks we will find that harder. And so now what I'm thinking is maybe doing the full run but having more breaks. I would like to have at least one day off every week. That would be nice. I'm not going to do the preview shows, but something that I found last year, one of my best shows was the very last day of the Fringe, because only about 10% of the shows were running on that last day of the Fringe, because everyone had finished the day before, and that was much easier to get an audience. If everyone only wants to go up for the second 2 weeks and the audience still comes up in that first week, then I would be quite happy to do that first week and hope that it means that it's less competitive for me, because I'm not up there to win an award. I'm up there to do nice shows to an audience who is interested in it. So if you can take out some of the competitive elements of it, then I would be happier with that.
So if, from your point of view, if it had been, say, 15 to 20 shows, that would have been your sweet spot?
I think so, yeah. I did really like doing the show again and again and again, and I think it is better now than before I went to the Fringe. And I was having a conversation with a group of friends after the Fringe where one of them had done his first post-Fringe show, and he was like, you forget, because when you get really into it in the Fringe, you're like, oh, I'm rubbish at this, no one wants to come see my show, the reviews haven't been as good as I was hoping they would, I just need to pack it all in. And then you get back from the Fringe, and then hopefully you sleep, and then you go do your first show, and then you you do like a 10 in a mixed bill or whatever, and then you realise how much better a performer you are now than you were in July. And so I did think it was a valuable experience just from a performance point of view, and I would like to do that. And I don't think in any of the other festivals that I've done there is the space to do that. I don't think that, I've done, the first time that I did Brighton Fringe, I did a week and I sold out, and it was very exciting. And then I went back the next year and I did 5 days, and I think I sold 20 tickets across the 4 or 5 days that I did it, and it was really hard to get an audience. And so I think Edinburgh is still the only place where you can do that many shows and, have some kind of audience every single night. And there is an artistic value in that, because it does make you a better performer, it does make your show better. But I don't think that I have to do 30 to get the value. And so,
as a performer, how do you balance, like you said, if you're doing the same show over and over, it's going to get better, you're going to work on it, versus doing something, something new. And, the interest of anything that's new is, generally speaking, that's shiny, it's new, it's more interesting than something you've done. But you've put all this work into building a show, and, you could probably do that show around the country for 5 years rather than one, and have to do a new show every year. I mean, where's the balance in terms of, having this comfortable show that you're happy with versus the interest of building something new?
Yeah, I mean, I started writing my new show in the middle of Edinburgh, which I don't know whether or not that's advisable. I think it depends a bit. I think it's definitely been an interesting question for a lot of people who started preparing their shows in January 2020, if not before that, because they were planning on debuting in Edinburgh 2020, and then the pandemic disrupted things. And then a lot of people had the question of like, well, I put together this show that I was really proud of and put a lot of work into it, and the question is now whether or not this is ever going to be seen by anyone, or if I do it anyway, and then is it going to feel really disconnected from everything that has happened? And I think stand-up comedy is one of, even if you're not a topical news satire comedian, it's one of the more topical art forms, and audiences like to feel the kind of relevance of the material that you're doing. And if you're going to do a show which is about something that happened a really long time ago, that still has to have some bearing on who you are now. And so I think it's quite difficult to do a show which feels very disconnected from a particular time and place. So I know that I think I would struggle to do the same show for 5 years and still to be performing this show in 5 years' time. I've done the show, we counted like 44 times now in one form or another. And the last time that I did it, I was like, I'm really glad that this is the last time that I'm going to do it.
Yeah, I'm the same, I think. I just can't sustain interest in stuff. I kind of, I told myself this year I was going to tour it. I was going to do the show and then tour it for a year. Because I've always thought with that thing of like, you get to the September and then you throw the show in the bin and then you start a brand new thing. And I've always been thinking like, maybe it's worth actually trying to like get more value out of the thing that you've made for a year. And possibly with a different show, I might have tried to make good on that. But the fact that the show I made has another performer in it, Bentage is in it with me, so whenever we tour it, I have to make sure his travel and accommodation is covered as well as my own, and that he gets a fee, because, you know, it's my name on the thing, so it's only fair that if anyone's going to lose money on a tour show, it's me, and Ben should be paid for his time. Also, there's this big set that I have to transport around and a huge bag of props, and we did a couple of tour date things with it, and I just thought, I can't do it. It doesn't make any sense to do another year of taking this all around the country, and I could sense my own, like, faith in this thing I'd made dissolving, like this thing that I was really proud of in Edinburgh, and then we took it to Soho and we were really happy with how it had gone. But the more exhausted I got by doing it, and by, you know, you add up all the expenses and go, oh, I made 30 quid on that show. You know, I just started to feel like, actually, this is going to kill my love for this thing. So I don't think I can do it again and again. But maybe if one day I made a show that was just me standing on stage and telling jokes, which I always tell myself I'd like to get better at doing, and I've never been able to do it. I always overcomplicate it. But maybe if I had a show like that that was much more tourable, then I might try and do that thing of giving it another year of taking it to other audiences. But this year was another one where I just went, nah, I gotta put that on the shelf again.
How does the rest of Scotland kind of work when the Fringe? You know, is there an audience in Glasgow where, you know, you've probably got loads of people who go into Edinburgh but live, you know, staying in Glasgow or interested in Glasgow? Could you just kind of piggyback on what Edinburgh is but not be in Edinburgh?
Oh, do you mean could you
if you did a weekend
in Glasgow?
Yeah, well, there's possibly, and also perform. So if you said, right, you know, there's a lot of people Edinburgh adjacent who are into arts where you're not paying Edinburgh prices, but you're getting a kind of a halo effect of it.
In the same month, you mean?
Yeah. Or does just everyone, is Edinburgh or nothing? I don't know.
Glasgow have tried it a few times, have they? I feel like Glasgow have had things going on to siphon audiences away.
I've done a show in Glasgow during Edinburgh once. I think it was a stand show that was on there, and I got the train across and just did a gig there. So I think like they run, and I think other Fringe comedians were doing the same. Like every day they were booking a bunch of the best Fringe comedians to come over to Glasgow and do like a bit of their show. So I think they put stuff on and try to kind of benefit from those comics being there. But I don't think they do it with a view towards trying to kind of set themselves up as a rival or anything, because there is a Glasgow Comedy Festival already that I think happens in March-ish, does it? Or it used to be. They might have changed it, because I know they moved it around a bit.
Should we not open our own Fringe in Berwick-upon-Tweed?
Yes.
In mid-August? In the first 2 weeks?
Because there has been a bunch of newer things, and I do see chat on like comedian Facebook groups where people are like, Buxton is the new one. If you get in on the ground floor, then when Buxton's like properly up and running in 5 years, you're going to be an established member.
Yeah, and I mean, we were talking about, you know, whether Edinburgh is a means to an end or something else. So I know, Joz, you've got a radio show that's just come out in the last few weeks.
Oh, yeah.
Did Edinburgh help in getting that, in terms of making connections and foot in the door and all those kind of things?
I don't know, really. It's sort of like the actual connection was from a web series I made years ago that the commissioner of Radio 4 comedy at the time, Sioned William, saw it. I can't remember if I sent it to her or somebody else sent it to her, or she just happened to see it, or what it was. But she called me in for a meeting and said, I like your stuff, we'd love to work with you, but you need a producer. And then I introduced myself to a producer she worked with, and it took about 5 years from that point of pitching things and being told this isn't quite the right idea this year, but we love your stuff, so try again next year. And during those 5 years, both Sinead and Steve, who produces my radio stuff, came to see my Edinburgh shows and really liked them, so they became like a kind of marker of that, of them going, oh yeah, this guy's good. But the actual initial thing came off the back of something else, actually. It was a thing I'd written and acted in. So I think they're just... The thing I always think with this is that, like, you'll never know exactly what any one piece of work unlocked for you. Like, all the work you do at the Fringe, it might be that 5 years later it pays off and you get something off the back of it because somebody saw you 5 years ago, but they might not even tell you that. It might just be that you've been kind of in their head and somebody they're sort of aware of, but they don't quite know what the right project is. So I think probably the fact that I did those Fringe shows during that time that we were trying to develop radio ideas hopefully did play into it and meant that they saw, oh yeah, we see this guy's building an audience and we like what he does in the live world as well. But I think the kind of simple like equation of you go to Edinburgh and you get this thing out of it never really works out like that, which is frustrating because you always want it to. I still want it to, and I still came back this year being like, oh, I wonder what I'm going to have got out of this year's Fringe. And then you remember like there's no such thing as that really. Or if I ever do find out what that is, it might be a decade from now that people go, oh yeah, I loved that show you did that year. So I think it all plays in, but I think the thing of like, we gave you this because of that Fringe show we liked is pretty rare, really. Unless you're one of the kind of like top 10 shows. I think, you know, those ones on that list maybe do just get given like, hey, what do you want to do? You can do whatever you like. But I think everything else, it's just a case of working and showing what kind of thing you like to do and talking to people about that work and trying to follow what you're interested in, and eventually all that turns into something. But I don't think it's a kind of press the button and you get the reward thing in that way.
Yeah. So, Cerys, you mentioned already writing your next show. So, as of late November as it is now, in your mind, have you got a form for that show? And you think, yes, I'm going to be doing it for 20, 30 nights in Edinburgh next August?
Yeah, I sat down last weekend because I've got a notebook and I write things in the notebook, and I've started writing things in the notebook since August, and I in my head was like, this is I've basically written it, I've got all of it's pretty much, I just need to put it all down in the right order and then it's going to be fine. And then on Saturday I did the process of extracting all of my notes from one notebook and putting them in a new notebook which was only for this show, and what I discovered is that I only have like 2 pages worth of stuff, and so it is not coming together. But yeah, I've started thinking about what started booking in opportunities to do work in progresses of it starting in the new year. I'm quite stressed about it because the last show I did my first work in progress at the Camden Fringe, which is also in August, and so that was in August 2021, and then I spent a whole year working on it, and Joz came into the project quite early on, and so I had like support pretty much from day one, and really felt like I had like a lot of time and space to develop the show ready for the Fringe, whereas this time round I will be starting in January and everything will happen a lot faster, which I don't deal with very well. So we'll see how that goes.
Do you kind of find that the work fits the time available, or do you think it'll be a lot harder this time?
I don't know. I think it will have to be that the work fits the time available. Whether or not I'd done it in a different way, would I have produced a different show? Would that show have ended up being better than the one that I will make? I'll make something. So, well, yeah, I don't know. It could be that, maybe last time I overthought it. I don't think I did. I think we thought about the show the correct amount of time for the last one. So,
yeah, I reckon so.
We'll find out.
And Joz, do you see yourself in Edinburgh next August, or are you not too sure yet?
Not in 2023, I don't think, because the thing I sort of learned from this year, there's 2 shows, like I've been going to the Fringe for years, but the 2 shows I look back on and go, I'm really, really proud of those shows, as opposed to like, I can see where I could have improved them sort of thing, the one I did this year and the one I did in 2019. and both of them were shows I did after having a year off. It took me 2 years to make each of those shows, and it was 1 year of kind of thinking about stuff and figuring out ideas and trying to work out what I was interested in, and then a year of turning all that into a show. So I think now that I've noticed that pattern, I feel like that's probably just the case. And I think also this year, because of the radio show, I really wanted to try and do more in that world, like do more writing and do more acting. And I thought I could go back to Edinburgh again in the hope that if I did really well up there, people might give me more of that work. But actually it felt a bit like trying to go sideways rather than trying to go forwards, sort of thing. And I thought, actually, if I try to do the work in that area and write more scripts and try to act in more scripts and make more films, then maybe that's where my heart is this year. And at the same time, I'll be trying to kind of gather thoughts that might turn into a live show, because I know I love making live shows, and I know I love a lot of what the Fringe is. I don't love it in its entirety, but I love a lot of what it can be. So I may well be back there in 2 years. But I think I've kind of said to myself, this is a year of not doing that sort of work. Not necessarily full stop, but like removing my reliance on it a bit and seeing what happens. It's quite scary because it just means at the moment I've got no idea what I'm doing. But I think I know where I want to go over the next year, and Edinburgh doesn't look like it's a part of it at the moment.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Stu, Joz and Cerys for their time. Check out the back catalogue for previous podcasts, including episodes with Stu and Cerys, along with other episodes talking to others in creative industries about making creativity pay.